This is the study session on economics and the reading on the firm and market structures. Let's get right to the first LOS, in which we are asked to describe those four types of market structures: monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, and perfect competition. And there's a good group of arrows there on the right side of the slide. Less competition at the top, more competition at the bottom. Let's go through each one of these individually. What is a monopolist? A monopolist, of course, is a profit maximizer, and monopolists are price makers. Monopoly, mono meaning one. There's a single seller that controls the entire market, which implies that there are things like price discriminations and very high barriers to entry. And so think of a monopolist as maybe the local water company or an energy company that doesn't have any competition within a given geographic area. Maybe some other utilities as well. Pure monopolies are regulated by the government. Now, suppose that we relax that assumption from the monopoly structure and allow for some kind of competition. And so we're going to call this monopolistic competition, in which there are multiple buyers and multiple sellers in the market, either working, the monopolistic competition works on one side or the other. What happens is that these monopolistic competitors are typically selling the same kind of a good or service, like maybe a t-shirt or a pair of socks or maybe some fast food chains. And so the idea here is, in order to maximize profit, what these monopolistic competitors have to do is differentiate their specific product line and try to brand that product line to make it more attractive to the consumers out there. They have some control over pricing, and there are a few barriers to entry. But of course, the classic example is comparing McDonald's to Wendy's. And with my children, if ever there is a choice between McDonald's and Wendy's, they always pick McDonald's. I have no idea why. Maybe adults have different kinds of thought processes. I would always pick Wendy's so I could get a Frosty. How about an oligopoly? This is a scenario under which there are just a relatively small number of firms who are supplying the market. And while those monopolies can set their own prices, the oligopolists have to either visit with each other to set the market price, or there can be differences in pricing. There'll just be small differences. Barriers to entry are high, and they have the potential to make long-run profits. The products in an oligopoly tend to be homogeneous, like oil and gas, or riding on an airplane, or a car. Perfect competition is probably what we're all searching for in terms of what a perfect economy would look like. Lots of buyers, lots of sellers in the market. Perfect information between those buyers and sellers. But here's a key element about this, is that the perfectly competitive firms, they are price takers. They have no influence over the price, no barriers to entry, and there's no single seller who is big enough or powerful enough or influential enough to set the market price. Price takers. All right, the next LOS asks us to explain the relationship between and among all these things that show up on an illustration that measures the relationship between output and the cost and dollars of that output. And so notice on the horizontal axis there is a Q for output, and then there are dollars going up the vertical axis. And so under all of these firms, the profit maximization point occurs where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And this is a fascinating concept, one in which I try to teach my children all the time. In fact, we just had a conversation about the marginal cost of playing on their smartphones versus the marginal benefits of it. And so marginal cost, marginal revenue, this is an important concept not only for parents, but it's also an important concept for firms in trying to maximize profit. Now, for the monopolist, their demand curve, of course, is downward sloping, but their demand curve is the market demand, because remember, they supply the entire market. And the demand curve is going to be equal to the average revenue curve. That's that top, is that a reddish line, downward sloping? But that demand and average revenue curve separates from the marginal revenue curve. And that's why there's another downward sloping, steeper downward sloping marginal revenue curve. And of course, what's going to happen is the monopolist is going to maximize profit where marginal costs equal marginal revenue. There's that dot right in the middle of the graph. But here's the cool thing, if you're a monopolist, is that because the marginal revenue and the average revenue curves are separate, the monopolist gets to charge the price all the way up there at P1. So that box there from P1 over to the average revenue curve, down to the average cost curve, and then over to the C1 on the vertical axis, that's the profit. That is the monopolist profit. Now, here's another thing to remember about monopolists. Since they supply the entire market, and since that average revenue curve is the market demand curve, that in order to produce more, in order to increase their output, they need to drop the price by maybe offering discounts or bundles. Now, here's the example that I like to give. Here where my family and I live, we have a particular cable provider, and the cable provides us with cable TV, and it provides us with a landline phone, and it provides us with access to the internet. And it also provides home security systems. So it has these 4 product lines. So in order to get me to pay, hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month, they bundle them together. And so that's kind of like a discount. And so, of course, the people that live in the area, when they see, hey, I can bundle this stuff together and I can get 4 things for maybe the price of 3. Of course, the reality of life is that, I think we have 6,000 channels on the TV and I watch 4 of them. How about monopolistic competition? This is a market structure that's somewhere between a monopoly and perfect competition. It's kind of theoretical, but it can be applied to maybe the hotel industry or the restaurant industry. In smaller kinds of populated areas, certainly not in a gigantic city, but they sell similar, if not identical, products, and they rely on differentiation. Now, here's the thing. If there is high demand for this particular product line, then what the firm will do to increase profits is to raise prices. And if there is low demand, what they'll do is lower prices to increase that market share. So think of the hotels. Whenever you're driving along the highway, you see all these billboards that say something like, hey, come stay with us. We have the lowest price in the area. I forgot to mention this. So what's happening here? The monopolistic competing firm is going to make decisions where marginal costs are equal to marginal revenues. And so that's going to happen at Q1 on the graph. But for the monopolistic competitors, that average cost curve is higher than the monopolist's average cost curve. And so the profits are going to be smaller per firm. They might be identical for the entire market, but they're going to be smaller per firm. And that's why that shaded region in there, that represents the profits for the monopolistic competitor. Now, the oligopolist, this is defined as a few large interdependent firms with some control over prices. But the cool thing here is that the elasticity for their product line is asymmetric. And so economists call this a kinked demand curve. So I want you to look out the top right portion of the graph where it is blue leading up to the X. That's where the demand curve is fairly elastic. Notice that the slope is kind of flat. And then after the X, it steeply downward slopes. That's relatively inelastic. So the oligopolist faces a kinked demand curve. And so the oligopolist, of course, is going to produce where marginal costs equal to marginal revenues. And what happens is that those marginal cost curves, because there's a kink in the demand curve, they're going to be separate at that same Q1. So at the Q1, depending on where that marginal cost curve is, will determine the oligopolist profit. That's why with an oligopoly, like with airlines or maybe energy suppliers in a relatively smaller populated geographic area, that people kind of tend to think that, these firms, they must be talking to each other to set their prices. I always have that thought in my area because gasoline prices at our local convenience stores are almost always identical. And I always think, boy, how can that be? If it's perfect competition, how can gas prices here be the same as over there? And sure enough, there are differences if you go far enough away from each of these gas stations. But asymmetric demand elasticity, and remember kinked demand curves for the oligopolist. Perfect competition here, there's going to be a straight line. Notice in the graph that the price is equal to the marginal revenue, which is equal to the average revenue, and that's a horizontal line. And so marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so, if you look at that thing in relation to the other graphs, there is no profit. And of course, in the long run, under perfect competition, there is no profit in the long run. You can have it in the short run, but in the long run, there is no profit because there are relatively few barriers to entry. And so as soon as a firm makes a profit, then some other firm is going to jump in and try to steal that profit away. And so in perfect competition, you got tremendous competition, and they are fighting. They are fighting for consumers' business at every level. And then, of course, the far right graph just shows the supply and demand curve for the industry. And that's the supply and demand curve that we drew in the previous slide. Now, how about the supply function under each market structure? For the monopolist, their supply function, remember, they're supplying the entire market. So their supply function is fixed because they know what the market is and they know what it can produce. Similar things with the oligopolist. Under the monopolistic competitive structure, the supply function is not too well defined, and it's really determined by the demand in the market. Now, here's the supply curve that we're used to seeing. That supply curve is upward sloping, and it is the marginal cost curve. Now, what's the relationship between elasticities and marginal revenues and marginal costs? And under the monopolist structure, you can see that it's a little bit, it's inverse because you have 1 over the elasticity. And so what you do is you can work that cost structure out, set marginal costs equal to marginal revenues on either side, and try to determine what is the best price. And that relationship is pretty similar under an oligopoly. Now, under monopolistic competition, that profit is just going to be total revenues minus total cost. And so revenues are P times Q, price times quantity, of course, and costs are C times Q, total costs, which includes fixed costs and variable costs. And so the pi sign down there in the middle of the slide tells us that the monopolistic competitor is going to maximize profit, is going to pick that price where total revenue minus total cost is maximized. And then under perfect competition, the market price, remember, perfect competitors are price takers, so that market price is going to be equal to its marginal cost. Here's a quick example about the linear relationship that we've kind of been implying here. Profit maximizing price and output. If the pricing and the marginal cost function are given to you in terms of quantity, and so we can just set those two equal to each other and then solve for Q and then substitute and solve for P. And so the profit maximizing price and output are 15 and 5 respectively. That's some pretty easy math, but feel free to stop, pause the slide just to make sure you can do the math. How about long run equilibrium? How are these factors that affect the long run equilibrium? Well, under the monopoly structure, that the monopolist has every incentive, including lobbying the politicians to maintain barriers, whether they are natural barriers like tremendous investment in heavy equipment, or artificial barriers, some law or regulation. Now, in order to establish long-run equilibrium in an oligopoly market, you got to understand that there are profits, and those profits attract new entrants. But those profits are going to decline over time, especially for the dominant firms. There's also declining profitability under monopolistic competition, but what happens, remember that those firms try to differentiate or brand their product lines to generate profit or market share. And then under perfect competition, I've said this before, long run economic profit is zero. Now, what kind of strategies do these firms pursue under each market structure? Remember, the monopolist provides the entire market, supplies the entire market. And so the monopolist is always tempted to raise prices. Of course, all firms are tempted to raise prices. But if the prices are raised high enough and that box of profit, remember that box from our graph before, if that box becomes too high, then there's going to be some competition. Now with the oligopoly, remember the pricing is set by between and among some of these dominant groups, and the pricing is going to be determined based on what the competition does. And so it's more of a follow the leader kind of a structure than anything else. Monopolistic competition, there's branding and differentiating again. And then under perfect competition, these guys are price takers. Now, remember that first slide where I said there was little competition at the bottom and little competition at the top and lots of competition at the bottom. Well, of course, there has to be some ways to measure this level of concentration or competition in the market. And so there are two well-defined measures. One is the concentration ratio, and one is the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. The concentration ratio is really pretty simple. It's just a sum of the market share of the largest firms within an industry. And, it's typically computed using the top handful of firms. And the values can be between 0 and 100%. The HHI is a little bit more complex. Mathematically, what you do is you square the market shares of the top firms and then you sum those. And so let me give you a good example here at the bottom. So if we have two top suppliers, holds 20 and 30% of the market share, then the concentration ratio of those two suppliers is 50%. Of course, 20 plus 30 is 50%. And so you can get a sense of whether or not that market is concentrated or not. Sounds to me like if two firms hold 50% of the market, then they can probably have some influence over the pricing structure. But since the HHI is a squared number, it adds a little bit more value to our understanding of concentration. And so in this case, we're just going to take the 20% squared and the 30% squared, and that gets us up to 1,300. And so if the this is kind of a standard reasoning, standard measure, a standard way of determining concentration levels. And so if the index is less than 1,500, we pretty much conclude that it is a competitive industry. If it's greater than 2,500, we pretty much say that that's a concentrated industry. And so I would be aware of both of those ratios and how to compute them and how to interpret them. Now remember this: more firms in the market means more competition. Lower concentration ratios means more competition. If there's product differentiation, that's a characteristic of monopolistic competition. And if there's more elasticity, remember, if changes in price result in wide swings in the quantity demanded, then there's going to be more competition. And that takes us through the firm and market structures. Up next, we switch over to a macroeconomic study.